from Numbers chapter 15, verses 37 to 41. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the people of Israel and tell them to make tassels on the corners of their garments throughout their generations, and to put a cord of blue on the tassel of each corner. And it shall be a tassel for you to look at and remember all the commandments of the Lord, to do them, not to follow after your own heart and your own eyes, which you are inclined toward after. So you shall remember and do all my commandments, and be holy to your God. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I am the Lord your God." This chapter comes after repeated failures in the life of the children of Israel. In chapter 11, we read about how the people murmured about their food. In chapter 12, describes the questioning of Miriam and Aaron against Moses. In chapter 13 and 14, the turning point is reached when the people refuse to believe God and enter the promised land. Hence, God's judgment was pronounced that none of the generation would enter the land except for Joshua and Caleb. Despite the harshness of this verdict, God continues to treat the nation with grace and forgiveness. He speaks through Moses again, saying, "When you come into the land you are to inhabit, which I am giving you." Notice the certainty with which God is speaking to them, giving them instructions as to their life in the promised land, despite the exclusion of a whole generation from that land. God surely wanted them to teach their children how to live when they entered Canaan. Some of these instructions continue the law of offerings. These instruct Israel how to give themselves to the Lord through offerings, how to cover their unintentional sins, and how to express their gratitude. Israel, at their point of failure, needed to be reminded of sacrificial atonement and the continued goodness of God. A meal offering and a drink offering were prescribed here as part of their regular burnt offering. It speaks about offering ourselves to God joyfully. The offering of a lamb required a 1/10 measure of flour. A ram required 2/10, and a bull required 3/10. If one takes the flour, oil, and wine of the grain offering to speak of joy and gratitude, this points to a principle. The greater our offering, the more joyful and thankful we ought to be that we are privileged to offer it to the Lord. In verses 17 to 21, speaks about bringing a heave offering of thanksgiving to the Lord when they come into the promised land. Even when these rebellious people were doomed to wander in the wilderness for another 38 years, the Lord set down instructions that, when read, would turn their minds towards the land flowing with milk and honey, where they could produce their own food. The first of their ground meal was to be a portion of dough made from the first harvest of the season. The gravity of unintentional sins is brought out here in that they too needed a blood atonement. A young bull had to be sacrificed when the nation was guilty, and a female goat had to be sacrificed when an individual was guilty. It is often thought that if an action is unintentional, it cannot be a sin. But many of the worst sins are committed with best of intentions. Good intentions does not excuse a sinful result. Anyone who committed a presumptuous sin, that is, deliberately choosing to disobey God, what he knew to be the will of God, was to be cut off from the people. We read, "But the person who does anything presumptuously, whether he is native born or a stranger, that one brings reproach on the Lord, and he shall be cut off from among his people. Because he has despised the word of the Lord and has broken his commandment, that person shall be completely cut off. His guilt shall be upon him. Part of this chapter describes the stoning of a man who went out on Sabbath day to gather sticks. This was a presumptuous sin, in that the whole congregation would have been at rest, and the Sabbath sacrifices would be in the process of being offered. This man was therefore well aware of what he was doing. By violating God's command openly, he was rebelling against God and making his disregard for God's commands very clear. The whole congregation was to stone him, thus making their abhorrence of such an attitude very clear. Under the law, every sin and transgression received this punishment without mercy. Our lives are full of both unintentional and deliberate sins and transgressions. We deserved richly to cut off from the people of God. It is only through the goodness of God that he sent Christ to reconcile us to himself through the sacrifice of himself on the cross. In the final instructions of this chapter, the people of Israel were asked to put tassels on the corner of their garments throughout their generations and to put a blue cord in these tassels. This blue, the color of the heavens, acted as a constant visible reminder to them to keep the commandments of God and to walk in his ways. The hem of their garments was always visible, and whenever they saw each other, these tassels would remind them that they were the people of God and were bound to live by his commands and precepts. This is a beautiful way to enforce the duty of remembering their duty to God in every part of their lives based on the law he had given them, rather than depending on their fickle and unreliable thoughts and feelings, or being led by the external attractiveness of what they perceived. The people of God should remind and exhort one another through their words and deeds of whom they are and what their lives should be patterned after. This is to be a constant practice. As often as they meet, the more so as we draw closer to the end. Finally, God talks about why he brought them out of Egypt. He says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I am the Lord your God. The primary purpose of taking them out of the land of Egypt was that they might be God's own beloved and special people. It was not for them to enjoy and experience the richness of Canaan, though that was promised as well. However, this would lose its charm, but the refreshing blessedness of the presence of God would endure forever. In summary, when we fail, we ought to come to the throne of grace to obtain mercy and grace. The death of Jesus for our sins, the just for the unjust, brought us through the death that we might live no longer as sinners, but through the Spirit of God. Our lives should be marked by giving thanks in everything, joyfully serving the Lord by giving what we have for the Lord, and thus acknowledging his hand in every life endeavor. Secondly, we need to remind and encourage fellow believers and be reminded and encouraged by them in our Christian walk. The value of accountability in a local church fellowship cannot be understated. The purpose is that we do not despise God and continue in our secret sins. Finally, in order for us to live a consistent Christian life, we need to keep our eyes on the purpose for which he has redeemed us, that is to be our God. A God-centered life means to live in harmony with God and his purposes. These were the remedies prescribed for a nation that constantly fell into the sin of rebellion and unbelief. May we always get up when we fail, encouraged by God's mercy, and follow him with all our heart, mind, and strength. God bless.